Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we journey deep into the echoing stone corridors of the Tudor court. Imagine yourself there, a silent observer, the rustle of silk and velvet a constant whisper in your ears, the scent of expensive perfumes mingling with the faint earthy smell of rushes on the floor. Tapestries woven with mythical beasts and heroic deeds adorn the walls, shimmering in the flickering torchlight, each thread holding centuries of secrets. You can almost feel the chill seeping from the ancient stone, the weight of history pressing in. But beneath this glittering facade of power and pageantry, a darker current flows, a shadow stretches, and a profound, quiet tragedy unfolds. You're about to witness the humiliation of a soul, a young girl caught in the cruel spotlight of royal indifference and courtly scorn. You probably won't survive this psychological descent into the heart of human cruelty, not with your modern sensibilities intact anyway. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight, and what time is it for you? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of the Great Hall, a newcomer, perhaps a minor attendant or a visiting dignitary's obscure relative, and the sheer scale of the Tudor court washes over you. It's a sensory overload, isn't it? The clang of distant bells, the murmur of 100 conversations, the sharp bark of a hunting dog outside, all blending into a symphony of power and privilege. You're trying to blend, to observe without being observed, but even your careful breathing feels too loud in this charged atmosphere. Every glance is a judgment, every step a potential misstep. You see Henry VIII, a magnificent, imposing figure even in your peripheral vision, holding court, his presence a gravitational pull that warps the very air around him. You watch the courtiers, a dazzling array of finery and ambition, each vying for a flicker of royal favour, their faces a carefully constructed mask of deference and cunning. It's a game, you realise, a high-stakes chess match, played out with lives and legacies as pawns. You find yourself drawn to the fringes, to the less celebrated corners where the true pulse of the court often beats, or perhaps where it aches. You notice the subtle hierarchy even in the way people stand, the way they hold their heads. There's a constant hum of gossip, a whispered word here, a knowing look there, and you try to piece together the unwritten rules, the unspoken narratives. You learn quickly that appearances are everything. A stain on your doublet, a misplaced bow, a comment misconstrued, any of these could spell social ruin, or worse. The air is thick with expectation, with the silent demand for perfection, for adherence to an unspoken code of conduct. It's a world where you must always be on, always performing, always aware of the 1,000 eyes that might be watching, evaluating. And then, a different kind of murmur begins to ripple through the room. Not the usual political intrigue or romantic dalliance, but something else. A note of morbid curiosity tinged with a dash of fear. You don't quite catch the words, but the shift in the collective mood is palpable. Heads turn, not with respect or admiration, but with a strange, almost voyeuristic fascination. You try to follow the direction of their gaze, straining to understand what has captured their attention so completely, yet so quietly. It's like a ripple in a perfectly still pond disrupting the placid surface of courtly decorum. You feel a prickle of unease, a sense that something is amiss, something that doesn't quite fit the grand narrative of this majestic court. You see a knot of ladies in waiting, usually so composed, now exchanging quick, nervous glances, their fans fluttering a little too rapidly. A group of gentlemen, usually boisterous, have fallen silent, their faces etched with a peculiar mix of pity and revulsion. You try to catch a fragment of conversation, but it seems they lower their voices precisely as you approach. It's almost as if you're being deliberately excluded from this particular secret, this shared, unsettling knowledge. And the more you try to understand, the more opaque it becomes, shrouded in the court's unique blend of discretion and cruelty. You realise that sometimes what is not said speaks louder than any pronouncement. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this period's sensibilities is the sheer importance of physical perfection and lineage within the royal courts. A monarch's health and appearance were seen as direct reflections of God's favour and the stability of the realm. Any deviation, any visible imperfection, could be interpreted as a bad omen, a weakness, or even divine displeasure. This placed immense pressure on royal families to produce healthy, unblemished heirs and cast a harsh light on anyone who did not fit this ideal. This societal expectation would, of course, have a profound impact on our subject. As you stand there, absorbing the atmosphere, a quirky or fringe tidbit crosses your mind, something you've read about the lengths people went to maintain appearances. Did you know that some courtiers, particularly those worried about their breath, would chew on angelica root or even cloves stuffed into oranges? It's not just about looking good. It's about smelling good, sounding good, presenting a flawless facade. Imagine the effort, the constant vigilance required to uphold such an exacting standard in a world without modern dentistry or deodorants. It makes you wonder what other secrets they hid beneath their opulent garments and powdered wigs. Historians still argue whether the extreme emphasis on physical perfection in the Tudor court was a purely cultural phenomenon, or if it had deeper roots in the medieval belief in humours, where physical ailments were often linked to moral or spiritual failings. Was it simply about aesthetics, or was there a pseudo-scientific, almost religious component to their disdain for perceived imperfections? The debate touches on how much scientific understanding, or lack thereof, influenced their social constructs. You feel a subtle shift in the air, a momentary hush, and then a ripple, not of polite applause, but of something far more unsettling. It's a collective intake of breath, a suppressed gasp. You crane your neck, pushing slightly through the crowd, your heart beginning to thump a little faster. Something is happening, something significant, and you know instinctively that this is what everyone has been waiting for, though dread is now beginning to mix with your curiosity. You follow the line of sight of the courtiers closest to you, their eyes fixed on a particular point in the hall, just beyond the ornate pillars. You can't quite make it out yet, but the tension is palpable, the silence thick with unspoken questions and judgments. The grandness of the hall, which moments ago felt so majestic, now seems to amplify the underlying sense of disquiet. You're on the cusp of an encounter, an introduction to the very heart of this untold story. You finally catch a glimpse, and the collective gasp you heard makes chilling sense. Through the shifting bodies of the courtiers, you see her. She's not grand, not resplendent like the royals, nor is she meek and unassuming like the lowlier servant. She's simply jarring. Your mind struggles to reconcile the image before you with anything you've ever seen. You feel a jolt, an involuntary recoil, even though she is some distance away. It's not just her appearance, it's the reaction she elicits, the way people avert their eyes almost immediately after looking, or fix their gaze with a strange, unnerving intensity. This isn't the subtle unease of political manoeuvring. This is raw, visceral discomfort, a collective shiver of repulsion that echoes through the lavish hall. You wonder, for a fleeting moment, if you've stumbled into a masquerade where one guest forgot their mask, or perhaps put on the wrong one entirely. She moves slowly, almost deliberately, as if each step is a monumental effort. Her head is bowed, her gaze fixed on the floor as if trying to shrink herself, to become invisible in the very space she occupies. You notice the way her clothing hangs on her, heavy and unadorned, devoid of the vibrant colours and intricate embroidery that define the rest of the court. It's almost as if her garments are designed to conceal rather than reveal, to blend into the shadows rather than stand out. The fabric is coarse, practical, a stark contrast to the silks and velvets that shimmer around her. You feel a pang of something akin to pity, mixed with the lingering unease. It's a strange cocktail of emotions, confusing and unwelcome in this place, where strong emotions are usually hidden behind polite smiles. As she draws a little closer, you begin to discern the details that make her so profoundly unsettling to the onlookers. It's not a single feature, but a combination, an accumulation of what the Tudor sensibility would deem imperfections. Her facial features seem off-kilter, asymmetrical, as if sculpted by an unsteady hand. One eye might appear slightly larger than the other, or perhaps a different shape. Her jawline could be pronounced in an unusual way, her forehead perhaps too broad or too narrow. These aren't the slight variations that make each face unique. They are pronounced enough to disrupt the expected harmony of human form, at least to the rigid aesthetic standards of the time. You imagine the whispered judgments, the silent comparisons to classical ideals of beauty that permeated even the less learned circles of the court. Her posture, too, adds to the unnerving impression. Perhaps a slight curvature of the spine, or a subtle unevenness in her shoulders, giving her a perpetual lean. Her limbs might seem disproportionately long or short, her gait a shuffling, hesitant movement. You consider the weight of gazes, the relentless scrutiny she must endure with every public appearance. Imagine living under such a microscope, where every physical attribute is catalogued, discussed, and ultimately judged. It's not just about what she looks like. It's about what her appearance represents to a society steeped in superstition and a belief in outward signs of inner character. To them, she is an anomaly, a disruption to their ordered, God-given world. You try to imagine her inner world. What must it be like to navigate such a hostile environment where your very presence elicits discomfort and disgust? Does she feel the stares? Does she hear the whispers, even if they are suppressed? You can almost taste the bitter tang of isolation that must cling to her, a constant companion in a crowded court. The silence that follows her, not respectful but wary, is perhaps louder than any shouted insult. It's the silence of avoidance, of a social void created around her by the collective fear of the unknown, of the other. And yet, there's a resilience in her slow, steady movement, a determination to exist despite the overwhelming pressure to disappear. One mainstream historical fact to consider here is the prevalence of folk medicine and superstition in the Tudor era. Medical understanding was rudimentary at best, and many physical abnormalities were attributed to supernatural causes, witchcraft, demonic possession, or divine punishment. This meant that individuals with unusual conditions were not just medically challenged, but often socially condemned, viewed with suspicion and fear rather than empathy or scientific curiosity. They were often seen as living omens, portents of ill fortune, which only amplified their marginalisation. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this era's understanding of the body is the belief in monstrous births being caused by a pregnant mother's imagination. If a pregnant woman saw something frightening or ugly, it was thought that her child could be born with similar features. This bizarre theory placed an enormous burden on women, implying that any physical anomaly in their child was a direct result of their own uncontrolled thoughts or weak character. It's a truly wild idea, placing the blame squarely on the mother's mental state rather than any biological reality. Historians still argue whether the concept of monstrous births was primarily a tool for social control, particularly over women, or if it genuinely reflected the limited scientific and theological understanding of congenital conditions at the time. Was it a deliberate mechanism to enforce conformity and punish deviation, or simply the best explanation a pre-scientific society could muster for something they didn't comprehend? The debate delves into the intertwined nature of fear, faith, and nascent medical inquiry. As you continue to watch her, you notice that no one approaches her, not out of respect, but out of a palpable desire to keep a safe distance. She is a pariah, a living testament to something the court wishes to ignore, to forget, but cannot. Even the most hardened courtiers, those who have witnessed beheadings and political purges without batting an eye, seem to shrink from her presence. It's a profound testament to the power of societal conditioning, to the deep-seated human fear of what deviates from the norm. You realise that in a world obsessed with bloodlines and appearance, she represents a disturbing flaw, an uncomfortable question mark in the meticulously crafted narrative of royal perfection. She isn't just a girl, she's a walking challenge to their worldview, and that, perhaps, is her greatest sin in their eyes. You sense that her story, far from being an isolated incident, is a mirror reflecting the broader prejudices and anxieties of the age. And as she finally shuffles out of your direct line of sight, the unease she brings lingers, a cold spot in the warm, bustling heart of the court. You know, with a chilling certainty, that this is just the beginning of understanding her plight and the depth of the humiliation she endures daily. The immediate shock of seeing her begins to recede, replaced by a more insidious, pervasive atmosphere of whispers. You notice them everywhere now, like an invisible mist clinging to the rich fabrics and carved oak panels of the palace. They are carried on the rustle of gowns, hidden in the clinking of goblets, woven into the polite murmurs of courtly conversation. You find yourself straining to catch fragments, piecing together the narrative the court is constructing around her, a narrative steeped in fear and morbid curiosity. It's a game of Chinese whispers, played with reputations and human dignity as the stakes. Each whispered word, each knowing glance, adds another layer to her isolation, another brick in the wall of her public humiliation. You hear snippets as you pass by groups of ladies sewing in a withdrawing room, or gentlemen gambling quietly in a corner. Did you see her today? Worse than ever, I swear. A punishment surely from God above. They say she shrieks at night like a banshee. The comments are delivered in hushed tones, almost conspiratorial, as if merely speaking of her might invite ill fortune. There's a morbid fascination, a perverse delight in discussing her misfortune, perhaps as a way of reinforcing their own perceived normalcy and divine favour. You feel a chill, not from the drafty corridors, but from the coldness of human judgment. It's a chilling reminder that in this era, charity and compassion often extended only to those deemed worthy by God and society. The speculation intensifies, branching into ever more fantastical theories. Some whisper of a curse, perhaps laid upon the royal line by a disgruntled witch or a wronged noble. Others suggest demonic influence, claiming her deformities are outward signs of an inner corruption, a soul tainted by evil. You even hear one particularly outlandish tale of her being a changeling, a fey creature left in the place of a human child, destined to bring misfortune to the House of Tudor. It's a grotesque tapestry of fear and ignorance, woven tighter with each passing day. You almost expect to hear someone suggest garlic or holy water as a remedy. So deeply ingrained is the superstitious dread. You notice how the children of the court are shielded from her. Governesses quickly steer their young charges away if she happens to appear, murmuring warnings about bad luck or ill humours. The innocent curiosity of childhood is swiftly extinguished, replaced by the learned fear of their elders. This early indoctrination ensures that the next generation will inherit the same prejudices, perpetuating the cycle of her isolation. It's a sad realization that even the youngest members of this society are taught to recoil, to judge, rather than to question or understand. You see the future of her humiliation etched in the faces of these averted children. The older, more educated courtiers, those who might possess a rudimentary understanding of the world beyond superstition, still fall back on accepted beliefs. They might speak of melancholy or an imbalance of humours, attempting to apply the limited medical theories of the day to her condition. But even their more scientific explanations are tinged with a moralistic undertone. An imbalance of humours could still be seen as a sign of a flawed constitution, perhaps inherited through a hidden weakness in the bloodline. There's no true empathy, no genuine desire to alleviate her suffering, only an intellectual pigeonholing that ultimately serves to distance her further. It's a subtle form of cruelty, cloaked in academic pretense. You observe how her presence, even when she's not physically present, becomes a subtle tool in courtly manoeuvring. A lord might warn his rival, "Beware, lest you become as unfortunate as her," or a lady might caution her daughter, "Mind your manners, or you'll frighten away all suitors, just like she does." She becomes a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything to be avoided, a grim reminder of the fragility of status and appearance in a ruthless world. It's a cruel irony that her very helplessness makes her useful to those who would exploit her circumstances. She is, in a perverse way, an object lesson, a silent sermon on the wages of imperfection. One mainstream historical fact that highlights this period's mentality is the rigid social hierarchy and the concept of noble blood. In Tudor England, your birthright determined almost everything: your opportunities, your status, your very identity. Physical abnormalities, particularly in someone even tangentially connected to the aristocracy, were profoundly disturbing because they challenged the notion of perfection inherent in noble lineage. If royalty was divinely appointed, how could such an anomaly exist within its orbit? This created a cognitive dissonance that society resolved by ostracizing the individual rather than questioning their fundamental beliefs. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the era that speaks to the power of belief over reason is the widespread practice of touching for the king's evil, scrofula. Monarchs, particularly English ones, were believed to possess divine healing powers, and thousands would flock to court to be touched by the king for various ailments, especially scrofula, a lymphatic disease. The fact that people genuinely believed in this royal touch, despite often meagre results, underscores the profound credulity of the age and the intertwining of faith, royalty, and pseudo-medicine. It makes her situation even more poignant, as there was no royal touch for conditions like hers, only avoidance. Historians still argue whether the constant fascination with portents and omens during the Tudor period was a genuine reflection of widespread public anxiety and religious fervour, or if it was skillfully manipulated by those in power to control narratives and suppress dissent. Was the fear of figures like the monster girl truly spontaneous? Or was it subtly encouraged by a court that benefited from a superstitious populace, especially when it came to maintaining the mystique of royal authority? The debate explores the thin line between organic belief and deliberate propaganda in an age without mass media. You sense that the whispers aren't just about her appearance, but about her very existence within the royal sphere. Why is she here? Why hasn't she been removed, hidden away? These unspoken questions hang heavy in the air, revealing the court's expectation that such an anomaly should simply cease to be seen. Her continued presence is an affront, a constant, uncomfortable reminder of imperfections in a world that craves order and flawless beauty. The court wants to forget her, but her very visible reality prevents that, and so the whispers become louder, more insistent, a relentless current of negativity designed to push her further and further into the margins of existence, to drown out her quiet suffering with a torrent of cruel speculation. You realise that her suffering is not just physical, but psychological, a relentless assault on her personhood, orchestrated by the very fabric of Tudor society. To truly understand her present humiliation, you must step back in time, away from the glittering cruel court and into the shadowed nursery of her early life. You find yourself in a quieter, more isolated corner of a lesser royal residence, perhaps a manor house granted to a distant noble relative, or even a secluded wing of a larger palace deemed suitable for housing those who were not meant for public display. Here, the lavishness of the main court is absent, replaced by a more subdued, almost monastic atmosphere. It's a place of hushed routines and muted colours, designed for discretion rather than grandeur. This is where her story truly began, not with a bang, but with a barely audible sigh of disappointment. You observe her as a child, small and fragile, perhaps even more so than her physical anomalies suggest. The whispers that you heard at court were born here, in hushed conversations between anxious nurses and wary attendants. From the moment of her birth, she was marked as different. The initial shock, the attempts to explain away her unusual features, quickly gave way to a cold acceptance of her fate. She was not a celebrated arrival. No bells rang in her honour. No feasts were held. Instead, her birth was met with a grim silence, a silent acknowledgement that this was not the heir, nor the charming child that the family had hoped for. Her nursery, you notice, is often empty of the usual bustle of courtly children. While other young nobles would be surrounded by a small retinue of nurses, tutors and playmates, she's largely left to her own devices. Her toys are few, simple and often neglected in a corner. There's a poignant emptiness in the air, a silence that speaks volumes about her isolation. You imagine her spending hours alone, perhaps tracing patterns on the cold stone floor with a finger, or gazing out a window at the grey skies, longing for interaction that rarely comes. It's a childhood devoid of the joyful shouts and playful squabbles that define normal youth. Her education, too, reflects her marginalised status. While royal children and even minor nobles would receive rigorous instruction in languages, music, dance and courtly etiquette, her lessons are rudimentary if they exist at all. Perhaps a sympathetic governess teaches her basic literacy, or an elderly chaplain offers a few lessons from the Bible. But there is no grand plan for her future, no preparation for a role in court or society. She's being taught only enough to exist, not to thrive. You see the unspoken message in this neglect. She is not expected to contribute, not expected to shine, only to remain quiet and out of sight. Her mind, perhaps keen and curious, is left largely uncultivated, a tragedy in itself. Her interactions with others are minimal and often strained. The nurses and attendants assigned to her are rarely kind, often distant, their faces etched with a weariness that borders on resignation. They perform their duties, but without warmth, without affection. There is no gentle touch, no comforting word, no genuine smile. You observe the way they flinch almost imperceptibly if she reaches out, or how they speak to her in clipped tones, careful not to encourage any intimacy. She learns early that human connection is a luxury denied to her, a barrier erected by fear and revulsion. You feel a profound sadness watching this, a sense of missed opportunities for tenderness and simple human kindness. Even her infrequent encounters with family members are marked by an awkward formality. Her parents, if they are still alive or present in her early life, might pay her a brief, obligatory visit, their faces betraying a mixture of pity and discomfort. There are no loving embraces, no whispered endearments. The visits are short, perfunctory, a duty discharged before they retreat to the more vibrant, less challenging world of the court. You see the pain in her eyes, even as a young child, the dawning realization that she is an object of disappointment, not affection. This foundational experience of rejection shapes her entire being, teaching her that her existence is a burden, her appearance a curse. One mainstream historical fact relevant to her upbringing is the practice of wet nursing and the frequent delegation of child-rearing among the aristocracy. Royal and noble children were often sent away from their mothers shortly after birth to be nursed by wet nurses and raised by governesses and tutors in separate households. While this was common practice, the degree of isolation she experienced would have been extreme, far beyond the norm, signifying a deliberate policy of keeping her out of sight and mind. She wasn't merely delegated, she was sequestered. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period, which only highlights her isolation, is the popularity of elaborate baby houses or miniature doll houses among wealthy families. These were not mere toys, but exquisitely detailed replicas of grand homes, complete with tiny furniture, servants, and even miniature silver. They served not only as entertainment but as tools for teaching young girls domestic management and social graces. The idea of our monster girl having such an intricate plaything, designed to prepare a child for a vibrant social life, seems utterly absurd and tragically out of reach for her. Her play was solitary, not preparatory. Historians still argue whether the extreme isolation and neglect suffered by children with severe deformities or perceived abnormalities in the Tudor era was primarily a result of religious fatalism, viewing them as divine punishment or omens, or a more pragmatic concern about preserving dynastic image and preventing taint on the family line. Was it genuine fear of God's wrath, or a cold calculation about social standing and the perception of purity within the aristocracy? The debate touches on the interplay of spiritual belief and worldly ambition in shaping treatment of the vulnerable. You see her grow, not in stature or confidence, but in her understanding of her place. She learns to be quiet, to be invisible, to take up as little space as possible. Her world shrinks to the confines of her secluded rooms, her interactions limited to the few, unfeeling adults tasked with her basic care. The grand narratives of the Tudor court, the power struggles, the lavish feasts, the romantic intrigues, unfold far away, a distant hum she can only imagine. She's a footnote to a story she can never truly be a part of, a living secret kept behind closed doors, her existence a source of discomfort and shame. This early life, stripped bare of affection and opportunity, lays the groundwork for the profound humiliation she will continue to endure as she inevitably moves closer to the unforgiving gaze of the royal court. Her true education was in silence, in loneliness, and in the bitter lesson of being perpetually unwanted. Having glimpsed her isolated childhood, you now shift your focus to the perplexing medical reality that shaped her entire existence. You approach this from a modern perspective, armed with centuries of scientific advancement, and the stark contrast with Tudor understanding is jarring. Imagine the fear, the confusion, the sheer lack of knowledge that surrounded any deviation from the physical norm. What to us might be a recognized syndrome or a genetic anomaly was to them a profound mystery, often interpreted through a lens of superstition and rudimentary, sometimes horrifying, medical theories. You consider her condition, striving to strip away the layers of fear and judgment that clouded its perception in the 16th century. It's likely a congenital condition, one present from birth, affecting her physical development. Perhaps it manifests as a facial dysmorphology, where certain features are disproportionate or asymmetrical. You might imagine a prominent forehead, deeply set eyes, or a jawline that recedes or protrudes in an unusual way. Her bone structure could be affected, leading to a subtle or more pronounced curvature of the spine, or an unevenness in her limbs, contributing to her awkward gait. Her joints might be hypermobile or stiff, further impeding her movement. You try to visualize the specific combination of features that would have so profoundly set her apart, creating the monster image in the unscientific minds of her contemporaries. The internal systems of her body, too, could have been affected, though this would have been entirely invisible to Tudor physicians. Perhaps she suffered from respiratory difficulties, making her breathing laboured, or digestive issues that caused chronic discomfort. Her senses might have been impacted, perhaps impaired vision or hearing, further isolating her. The chronic pain, if present, would have been silently borne, with no effective remedies beyond crude herbal concoctions or opiates that would merely dull the senses rather than cure the ailment. You feel a deep empathy for the physical burden she carried, a burden compounded by the complete lack of understanding or genuine medical care. You observe the physicians of the era, more often than not, barber surgeons or apothecaries, whose understanding of anatomy and physiology was largely based on ancient texts and empirical observation, often mixed with superstition. Their diagnostic tools were limited to observation, pulse-taking, and examining bodily fluids. They would have scratched their heads, perhaps murmuring about unbalanced humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile and black bile, the prevailing medical theory of the time. They might have attributed her condition to an excess of black bile, for instance, which was associated with melancholy and deformities. This wasn't a scientific diagnosis, it was a philosophical pigeonholing, offering no path to treatment. The proposed cures for such conditions would have been a bizarre and often dangerous mix. You might imagine them suggesting purges to rebalance her humours, forcing her to consume noxious concoctions of herbs, animal parts and minerals designed to induce vomiting or violent bowel movements. They might have advocated for bloodletting, opening a vein to drain bad blood, a common practice for almost any ailment. Leeches, cupping, blistering. These were the tools of the trade, applied indiscriminately with little regard for the actual condition, often weakening the patient further. You recoil at the thought of the indignities and suffering she would have endured under the guise of healing, her body subjected to painful and pointless interventions. Then there were the more superstitious remedies. You might hear whispers of tying certain charms around her neck, or invoking saints, or perhaps even visiting holy wells for miraculous cures. Some might suggest that her condition was a result of the mother's imagination during pregnancy, as you recall, leading to remedies focused on the mother's post-birth rituals. You even imagine a desperate family member seeking out a cunning woman or a local witch, hoping for a magical solution to a problem that defied all logical explanation. It's a sad testament to the despair and helplessness that families must have felt, resorting to anything, no matter how outlandish, in the face of the unknown. One mainstream historical fact to underscore the medical ignorance is the lack of germ theory. Diseases and conditions were not understood as being caused by microorganisms, but rather by miasmas, bad air, imbalances of humours, or divine displeasure. This fundamental misunderstanding meant that sanitation was poor, surgical practices were dangerous, and treatments were often ineffective or actively harmful, making any congenital condition even more perilous to live with. A quirky or fringe tidbit of Tudor medicine that highlights their approach is the use of powdered mummified remains as medicine. Yes, you heard that right. Ground-up Egyptian mummies, imported and sold by apothecaries, were believed to have curative properties for a variety of ailments, from headaches to the plague. The idea was that the spirit of the ancient dead, preserved within the mummy, could transfer healing power. Imagine the desperation that would lead someone to ingest such a bizarre concoction, a testament to the era's blend of genuine curiosity, desperate hope, and profound unreason. Historians still argue whether the medical community of the Tudor era was genuinely committed to empirical observation and rational inquiry, despite their limitations, or if they were largely bound by the rigid dogma of ancient Greek and Roman texts like Galen, stifling innovation and critical thinking. Was there a genuine spirit of scientific exploration, or were they simply performing rituals inherited from antiquity? The debate touches on the slow, painful birth of modern medicine from its superstitious and philosophical roots. You see her then as a living medical mystery in an age utterly unprepared to solve it. She's a testament to the limits of human knowledge, a challenge to their accepted worldview. Her very existence, a puzzle wrapped in an enigma, fuels the fear and the fascination. She's not just a person with a condition. She's a canvas upon which the era projects its deepest anxieties about divine will, human imperfection, and the chaotic unpredictability of nature. And as you step back, you realise that her humiliation is not just social, but also the humiliation of a body that simply does not conform, subjected to ignorance and cruelty under the guise of care. The lack of understanding only magnified her suffering, condemning her to a life of physical discomfort and perpetual ostracism. From the quiet, isolated world of her early life and the baffling realm of Tudor medicine, you're now thrust back into the bustling yet utterly merciless environment of the royal court. You realise that for the monster girl, the court is not a place of refuge or opportunity, but a stage where she's not a player, but a prop, a curiosity, an object of macabre amusement. The opulence and grandeur that once captivated you now seem to amplify the underlying cruelty, making her humiliation even more stark against the backdrop of glittering power. You witness the scene, not as a direct participant, but as an observer behind a velvet curtain, or perhaps mingling discreetly among the less significant attendants. The court, starved for diversion, always hungry for something new to talk about, has found a morbid fascination in her. Her appearances, though likely infrequent and controlled, become events of perverse interest. When she's led through a corridor or briefly present in a receiving line, a ripple of excitement, twisted and uncomfortable, sweeps through the courtiers. It's like a whispered game of spot the oddity, a cruel pastime for those with too much time and too little empathy. You notice the hushed giggles, quickly stifled behind elegant hands, or the widening of the eyes followed by an immediate exaggerated effort to appear composed. Some courtiers, particularly the younger, more impressionable ones, struggle to hide their discomfort, their faces betraying a mixture of fear and fascination. Others, the older, more jaded members of the elite, have perfected the art of the dismissive glance, a quick, almost imperceptible assessment, followed by a turning away, a gesture that screams unworthy of my attention. Yet, even in their dismissal, there's a clear acknowledgement of her presence, a deliberate act of othering. The children of the court, less adept at concealing their true feelings, often provide the most heartbreaking evidence of her humiliation. You might see a group of them pointing, their innocent faces contorted in expressions of confusion or even revulsion, before a governess swoops in to scold them, not for their cruelty but for their lack of decorum. It is impolite to stare, they are told, never, it is unkind to judge. This societal conditioning ensures that her status as an object of curiosity, rather than a human being, is reinforced from the earliest age. You imagine the cutting clarity with which a child's unvarnished reaction would pierce her already wounded spirit. Sometimes the amusement takes a more active, insidious form. You might hear stories, passed around like scandalous jokes, of attempts to provoke a reaction from her. Perhaps a footman nudges her in the corridor, pretending it was an accident just to see her stumble. Or a lady in waiting might drop something in her path, forcing her to stoop, hoping to highlight her awkward movements for the entertainment of others. These aren't grand public spectacles of torture, but rather small petty cruelties, chipping away at her dignity bit by bit, day after day. It's the relentless drip of humiliation, far more corrosive than a single, overt act. You observe how the conversations around her are always about her appearance, never her person. Did you see her nose today? So crooked. Her eye. It watches everything, like a snake. She's reduced to a collection of deformities, stripped of her humanity in the eyes of those who should have offered protection, or at least indifference. Her inner world, her thoughts, her feelings, her potential for joy or sorrow, none of this matters. She's merely a visual aberration, a talking point, a fleeting distraction from the endless rounds of hunting, feasting, and political intrigue. One mainstream historical fact that lends context to this cruel amusement is the existence of freak shows, or public displays of individuals with unusual physical characteristics, which were popular entertainment across Europe for centuries, including the Tudor period. While she wasn't formally exhibited in a travelling show, the court's treatment of her effectively turned her into their private spectacle, fulfilling a similar morbid curiosity among the elite. The line between courtly observation and public exhibition was dangerously blurred when it came to those considered anomalies. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the era that exemplifies this morbid fascination is the collection of cabinets of curiosities, or Wunderkammer by wealthy nobles and scholars. These were rooms filled with exotic natural specimens, scientific instruments, ethnographic artifacts, and sometimes even preserved anatomical oddities. The monster girl might not have been literally displayed in such a cabinet, but the mindset that drove their creation, the desire to classify, categorize, and marvel at the unusual and monstrous, was undoubtedly applied to her living presence. Historians still argue whether the court's fascination with individuals like her was primarily driven by genuine theological fear, viewing them as a sign of divine displeasure or a demonic influence, or a more secular, albeit cruel, desire for entertainment in an era before mass media and varied leisure activities. Was it piety or perversity that fueled their gaze? The debate touches on the complex motivations behind human behaviour when confronted with the profoundly unfamiliar, especially within a closed, privileged society. You feel a sense of profound helplessness as you observe these interactions. There is no one to intervene, no voice raised in protest. The king is oblivious, or perhaps simply unconcerned. The queen, as you will see, may offer fleeting moments of kindness, but she too is constrained by the rigid social codes and the demands of her own precarious position. The courtiers, eager to maintain their favour and avoid drawing negative attention to themselves, are unlikely to challenge the prevailing attitudes. And so, the girl is left to bear the brunt of their collective gaze, their whispers and their petty cruelties. Her silent endurance is a testament not only to her strength, but to the overwhelming power of the system that entraps her. Her humiliation, you realise, is not an accident. It is an inherent, unshakable part of her existence within the heart of the Tudor court, an entertainment to be consumed and discarded at leisure. Having witnessed the court's cruel amusement, you now turn your gaze towards the very pinnacle of power, the man whose word could have altered her tragic fate, yet chose to remain detached, King Henry VIII. You observe him in his full, imposing presence, a monarch of immense ego, insatiable appetites, and a will as unyielding as the Tower of London. Around him swirls a constant eddy of activity, a vibrant tapestry of flattery, ambition and fear. Yet, despite his absolute authority, her existence barely registers in his grand scheme of things, a testament not to his cruelty perhaps, but to his chilling indifference. You stand at a respectful distance, watching him preside over a council meeting. He's jovial one moment, roaring with laughter at a jester's antics, and then, with a flick of his wrist, he can condemn a man to the block. His mind, you realise, is consumed with matters of state, of succession, of his own divine right to rule. He strategizes about wars, contemplates diplomatic alliances, and most pressingly, obsesses over the production of a legitimate male heir. Everything revolves around his desires, his legacy, his immense, all-consuming self. In this vast universe that is Henry VIII's mind, the monster girl is a distant, insignificant speck. When she is occasionally present in the same room, perhaps led by an attendant through a corridor he is traversing, you notice his reaction, or rather, his lack thereof. There is no open revulsion, no pointed finger, no shouted command for her removal. Instead, there is merely a blankness, a gaze that passes over her as if she were a piece of furniture or an indistinct shadow. He simply does not see her. She's beneath his notice, an irrelevance. This isn't the active cruelty of the courtiers, but a far more chilling form of dehumanization. Utter disregard. To be truly invisible to the most powerful man in the kingdom is a form of obliteration. You might imagine a brief perfunctory report reaching his ears from a court official about the unfortunate child in residence, perhaps in the context of household expenses or logistical arrangements. Henry, if he even listens, would likely dismiss it with a wave of his hand. See to it, he might grunt, or let the appropriate chamberlain handle it. His concern lies with the healthy, the useful, those who can serve his ambitions or propagate his line. A girl with physical anomalies by his standards falls into none of these categories. She is a non-entity, a problem to be contained and forgotten, not solved or acknowledged. His indifference stems, you realise, from a deeply ingrained Tudor belief system. The king, as God's chosen representative on earth, embodied physical perfection and divine favour. Any imperfection in his household, especially one as pronounced as hers, was an uncomfortable anomaly, a dissonant note in the symphony of his divinely ordained reign. By ignoring her, he effectively wished her out of existence, asserting his perception of a flawless, God-blessed court. Her presence was a minor irritant, a reminder of the unpredictable nature of birth, something he preferred not to dwell on, particularly as his own quest for a male heir became increasingly fraught with physical and personal setbacks. You consider the pressures on him, the constant need to project strength, the anxieties of succession, the burgeoning reformation that demanded his unwavering focus. In such a high-stakes environment, compassion for an individual deemed unfortunate or unnatural would have been seen as a weakness, a distraction. His priority was the stability of his realm and the continuity of his dynasty, not the welfare of a marginalised girl. This pragmatic, almost brutal calculus of power leaves no room for empathy for those who cannot contribute to the grand narrative of his reign. One mainstream historical fact that highlights Henry VIII's perspective is his obsession with producing a male heir, leading to his multiple marriages and the English Reformation. This single-minded pursuit dwarfed all other concerns. A child with physical challenges, particularly a girl, would have held absolutely no dynastic value in his eyes. In fact, her existence might even be viewed as a minor embarrassment or a bad omen, subconsciously reinforcing his need for perfect offspring. A quirky or fringe tidbit about Henry VIII that subtly contrasts with his indifference to the girl is his personal enthusiasm for elaborate court entertainments and masks. He would actively participate, often designing costumes and roles, and was known for his love of music, dancing and jousting. He poured immense energy into creating a vibrant, often extravagant, courtly life for himself and his favoured courtiers. The fact that he was so deeply engaged in creating these illusions of perfection and joy makes his blindness to the girl's quiet suffering even more stark. He saw what he wanted to see, and she simply wasn't part of that curated vision. Historians still argue whether Henry VIII's notorious ruthlessness and lack of empathy, particularly towards those who disappointed him, like his wives or inconvenient children, was a personality trait inherent from birth, gradually amplified by absolute power, or if it was a necessary facade adopted to survive and thrive in the brutally competitive and dangerous political landscape of the Tudor court. Was he simply an unfeeling man, or did the demands of his role force him to suppress any natural human compassion? The debate delves into the psychological toll of monarchy in an age of constant threat. You feel a profound sense of despair watching this dynamic. Her very existence challenges the king's self-image and the court's illusion of perfection, yet he refuses to engage with it. He doesn't need to actively humiliate her. His profound disinterest is humiliation enough. It sends a clear message to the entire court: this life holds no value, and in a world where royal favour was everything, to be deemed worthless by the king was a sentence of social death. She's allowed to exist, but she's not allowed to truly live in any meaningful sense. Her fate is sealed, not by malice, but by the cold, calculating heart of a king who saw only what served his purpose and disregarded all else. In stark contrast to the king's chilling indifference, you now turn your attention to a figure of surprising, if subtle, compassion, Catherine of Aragon. Her life at the Tudor court, particularly as Henry's affections waned, was a masterclass in quiet endurance and unwavering dignity, and within the confines of her increasingly isolated world, you observe moments, brief, almost imperceptible, where her innate empathy shines through, directed towards the very girl the rest of the court shuns. You watch Catherine in her chambers, perhaps after a particularly trying day of enduring Henry's coldness, or the thinly veiled insults of Anne Boleyn's rising faction. She is a woman forged in the crucible of Spanish royalty, steeped in Catholic piety, and possessed of a quiet strength that belies her increasingly fragile position. Her robes, though still rich, might be a little less vibrant than they once were, reflecting the slow dimming of her influence. Yet, her eyes, though often weary, still hold a deep, unwavering gaze, capable of seeing beyond the superficial. It is in these private moments, or perhaps during the few occasions when the monster girl is brought into her presence for some minor, obscure household duty, that you notice Catherine's unique reaction. There is no shock, no revulsion, no averted gaze. Instead, you see a flicker of recognition, a softening around her eyes, a genuine pity that cuts through the artificiality of court life. It's not pity born of horror, but of understanding, perhaps even a shared sense of otherness. of being marginalised in a world that increasingly casts her aside. You might observe Catherine offering a small, kind gesture. Perhaps she directs one of her own ladies to ensure the girl receives a slightly better portion of food or a warmer shawl during a cold spell. It would be done discreetly, without fanfare, precisely because any overt display of sympathy could be misinterpreted or even used against her by her rivals. But these small acts, almost invisible to the casual observer, speak volumes. They are rays of warmth in the girl's perpetually cold existence. You imagine Catherine speaking to her, not with the clipped, formal tones of the other attendants, but with a gentle cadence, a soft inquiry about her well-being. Perhaps she asks a simple question, genuinely waiting for a response, acknowledging her presence as a thinking, feeling being, something almost no one else at court bothers to do. This simple act of human recognition, the gift of being seen rather than merely observed, would be a profound comfort to the girl who has known only invisibility and scorn. Catherine's deep religious faith plays a significant role in her compassion. As a devout Catholic, she would have been taught that all souls are equal in the eyes of God, and that charity and kindness towards the vulnerable were paramount virtues. Unlike many of her contemporaries who might view physical anomalies as divine punishment, Catherine's piety likely led her to see the girl as a soul in need of grace, a fellow human being suffering under a heavy burden. Her faith offered a framework for empathy that the more pragmatic, self-serving court lacked. You also consider Catherine's own struggles with miscarriages and infant mortality. She knew firsthand the fragility of life, the pain of loss, and the anxieties surrounding healthy childbirth. While her own children were physically normal, she understood the deep anguish that could accompany the challenges of procreation. This personal experience, though different in nature, might have fostered a unique sense of identification with the monster girl, seeing in her another tragic outcome of nature's unpredictable hand. She too had been judged for her inability to produce a living male heir, a different kind of imperfection in the eyes of the king. One mainstream historical fact to consider here is Catherine of Aragon's unwavering devotion to her Catholic faith throughout her life, even as Henry VIII broke with Rome to secure his divorce. This profound piety shaped her moral compass and dictated her actions, often placing her at odds with the increasingly secular ambitions of the English court. Her compassion for the monster girl is a direct outflow of these deeply held religious convictions, a quiet rebellion against the court's brutal pragmatism. A quirky or fringe tidbit that might shed light on Catherine's character is her dedication to embroidery and needlework, often creating intricate ecclesiastical vestments and personal garments. While seemingly a domestic detail, this craft requires patience, precision, and a quiet, contemplative nature. It suggests a woman capable of focus and gentle artistry, characteristics that align with the subtle, deliberate kindness she might have extended to the monster girl, rather than the boisterous grand gestures common in court. Imagine her quiet concentration, a stark contrast to the court's outward show. Historians still argue whether Catherine of Aragon's steadfast refusal to accept Henry's annulment, and her continued insistence on her rightful place as queen, was primarily an act of religious principle and deeply held moral conviction, or if it was also an astute political strategy to protect her daughter Mary's claim to the throne and her own honour. Was her resolve purely spiritual, or did it also contain a calculated element of self-preservation? The debate highlights the complex interplay between faith, personal conviction, and political necessity in her life, and by extension, in her capacity for quiet acts of compassion. You observe that Catherine's kindness is a subtle defiance. It is not a challenge to the king, nor a grand pronouncement. It is a quiet acknowledgement of shared humanity, a brief oasis of warmth in the girl's desolate existence. These moments are few and far between, like rare wildflowers pushing through cracked pavement, but their impact is disproportionately large. They offer a fragile testament to the enduring power of empathy, even in the most unforgiving of environments. For the monster girl, these fleeting glimpses of compassion from the Queen herself would have been a lifeline, a fleeting reminder that not all hearts in the cold, grand palace were hardened against her. Her humiliation, for a few precious seconds, might have been momentarily eased by the simple grace of a woman who understood, in her own way, what it meant to be cast aside. Following the subtle, almost hidden compassion of Catherine of Aragon, your gaze now shifts to her daughter, Princess Mary. You watch her navigate the precarious landscape of the Tudor court, a landscape that grew increasingly hostile to her as her mother's star waned and her own legitimacy came under attack. Mary, a child of deep religious conviction and an even deeper sense of loyalty to her mother, often mirrored Catherine's reserved demeanour. Yet within her too you discern fleeting moments, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, of pity for the monster girl. These moments are not grand acts of charity, but rather tiny fissures in the walls of her own suffering, through which a brief, almost involuntary spark of empathy escapes. You observe Mary as a young princess, perhaps during a period when her own status is already beginning its perilous decline. She's a serious child, often sombre, burdened by the weight of her parents' escalating conflict and the constant threat to her position. She's known affection, certainly, from her mother and her loyal household, but she has also experienced the chilling shift of courtly favour, the sudden coldness from those who once fawned over her. This personal experience of marginalisation, however different in its origins, grants her a sliver of understanding for the girl who is consistently shunned. When the monster girl is occasionally present in Mary's vicinity, perhaps performing some menial task or merely existing in the periphery of a court gathering, you notice Mary's reaction. It's not the open revulsion of the superficial courtiers, nor the profound indifference of her father. Instead, Mary's eyes might linger for a fraction of a second longer than others. There's a subtle softening of her usually severe expression, a flicker of something akin to recognition. It's a shared glance, perhaps, that acknowledges a mutual understanding of being an outsider, even if their reasons for being so are vastly different. You might see Mary making a small, almost unconscious gesture. Perhaps she might accidentally on purpose leave a small uneaten piece of a pastry or a fruit on a table that she knows the girl will pass later, a subtle offering of sustenance beyond her meagre official rations. Or, if the girl is struggling with a chore, Mary might look away, giving her a moment of privacy from the incessant courtly gaze, rather than joining in the unspoken judgment. These are not acts of defiance, merely minute deviations from the court's cruel norm, born of a quiet, internal struggle. Consider Mary's upbringing steeped in her mother's devout Catholic faith. Like Catherine, Mary would have been taught the Christian virtues of charity and compassion for the less fortunate. While the political climate of the court might have hardened her over time, especially as she fought for her own survival and legitimate claim, these foundational teachings would have been deeply ingrained. To her, the monster girl was likely not a monster, but another of God's creatures, suffering a difficult earthly existence, deserving of grace. This religious perspective offers a stark contrast to the superstitious fears of many courtiers. You recall Mary's own physical ailments later in life, her phantom pregnancies, her general ill health, which would eventually earn her the moniker Bloody Mary, though that was more about religious persecution than physical state. Even as a young woman, she was often sickly, enduring various fevers and discomforts. This personal familiarity with physical vulnerability, however minor compared to the girl's condition, might have fostered a quiet, private empathy for those who struggled with their bodies. It's a subtle thread connecting their disparate lives, a shared experience of corporeal weakness in a world that prized strength and perfection. One mainstream historical fact that profoundly shaped Mary's character and explains her moments of pity is her unwavering loyalty to her mother, Catherine of Aragon. Mary witnessed firsthand her mother's public humiliation and subsequent marginalisation by Henry VIII. This experience of seeing someone she loved and respected systematically stripped of her dignity would have instilled in Mary a deep personal understanding of what it meant to be an outcast at court, fostering a capacity for empathy towards others in similar, albeit different, predicaments. A quirky or fringe tidbit about Princess Mary that highlights her complex character is her passion for music, particularly playing the virginals. She was a highly accomplished musician, known for her skill and dedication. This artistic pursuit suggests a sensitivity and an inner world richer than her often grim public persona might suggest. Imagine her retreating to her music, finding solace in its harmony, a stark contrast to the discordant world outside. This interior life might have been where her fleeting pity for the monster girl found its quiet space to exist. Historians still argue whether Princess Mary's later reign, marked by intense religious persecution, was primarily a product of her deep-seated Catholic convictions and a desperate attempt to restore England to Rome, or if it was also influenced by her traumatic upbringing and the profound psychological scars inflicted by her father's actions, leading to a rigid and unyielding nature. Did her personal suffering harden her to the point of cruelty, or was her faith the sole driver of her policies? The debate explores the complex interplay between personal trauma, religious fervour, and political action in shaping a monarch's legacy. You sense that Mary's compassion, though fleeting, is an authentic response, a quiet human reflex in a court that often suppresses such impulses. It's a testament to her inherent goodness, even as her own path would lead her to become a figure of historical controversy. For the monster girl, these brief flickers of kindness from a princess, however subtle, might have been like microscopic drops of water in a vast desert of neglect. They wouldn't alleviate her suffering, nor would they change her fate, but they would, for a precious moment, remind her that she was not entirely alone, that a shred of humanity could still pierce through the impenetrable wall of courtly indifference. Her humiliation remained, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was momentarily softened by the silent empathy of a fellow royal outcast. Having seen the grudging pity of Mary, you now shift your focus to another young princess, one whose future would be dramatically different, Elizabeth. You observe her as a child and young woman, a brilliant, sharp-witted individual whose early life was steeped in uncertainty and danger. Unlike Mary, whose compassion for the monster girl stemmed from a shared sense of victimization and religious piety, Elizabeth's reaction is marked by a chilling, almost pragmatic detachment. You witness the forging of a queen who would later rule with an iron will, a woman who learned early to calculate, to survive, and to distance herself from anything that did not serve her ultimate purpose. You see young Elizabeth, perhaps during her precarious childhood, navigating the treacherous waters of her father's court after her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed. She is intelligent, quick to learn, absorbing every nuance of courtly politics. She understands instinctively that survival depends on presenting a flawless facade, on showing no weakness, no emotional vulnerability. Her tutors instill in her a profound love of learning and a sharp intellect, but the court teaches her a more brutal lesson. Sentimentality is a luxury no one in her position can afford. When the monster girl is present, Elizabeth's gaze is analytical, not empathetic. She might observe the girl's features, her movements, with a quiet, almost scientific curiosity, as if she were studying a new specimen. There is no overt disgust, no visible recoil, but neither is there any warmth or pity. Instead, her eyes seem to measure, to assess, to categorize. It's a cold calculation, an evaluation of potential threat or irrelevance. To Elizabeth, the monster girl is not a suffering human being, but an object lesson in what not to be, a stark reminder of the consequences of physical imperfection in a world where perfection was paramount. You might imagine Elizabeth overhearing the whispers about the monster girl, the superstitious fears, the morbid jokes, and filing them away. She would learn from them, absorbing the court's prejudices and understanding how such an individual could be used, or rather not used, in the great game of power. She would likely see the girl as a profound political liability, a walking anomaly that disrupted the carefully curated image of a divinely favoured royal house. Her own position was tenuous enough. She could not afford to associate with anything that might invite further scrutiny or question her own legitimacy. Her practical nature would dictate her response. If the monster girl required something, Elizabeth would likely ensure it was provided, but out of a sense of order and proper management of the royal household, not out of personal concern. It would be a logistical matter, not a humanitarian one. She would delegate, distance herself, and ensure that the necessary arrangements were made to keep the girl out of her immediate orbit, and more importantly, out of her mind. This cold efficiency is a hallmark of her developing character, a stark contrast to her half-sister Mary's emotional depth. You consider Elizabeth's own physical appearance. She was known for her striking red hair, her pale complexion, and her piercing eyes. She carefully cultivated her image throughout her life, using fashion, jewellery, and portraiture to project an aura of strength, intelligence, and even a unique, almost ethereal beauty. The monster girl would have represented the antithesis of everything Elizabeth strived to embody, a living reminder of physical vulnerability and deviation from the norm, something Elizabeth would have consciously rejected and distanced herself from. Her experience of being declared illegitimate and living under constant suspicion also shaped her. she learned to guard her emotions, to trust few, and to rely solely on her intellect and political acumen. In such a cutthroat environment, showing weakness or undue sentimentality could be fatal. Her calculating detachment from the monster girl is therefore not simply a lack of empathy, but a survival mechanism, a testament to the harsh lessons she absorbed about the price of imperfection and the necessity of projecting an unassailable image. One mainstream historical fact that profoundly shaped Elizabeth's early life and character, leading to her calculating nature, was her mother Anne Boleyn's execution for treason and Elizabeth's subsequent declaration of illegitimacy by her father, Henry VIII. This traumatic experience, coupled with her precarious existence under Edward VI and Mary I, taught her the paramount importance of political savvy, self-preservation, and emotional control, hardening her against any display of vulnerability or sentimentality. A quirky or fringe tidbit about young Elizabeth that contrasts with her coldness towards the monster girl is her exceptional proficiency in languages, particularly Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. She famously translated classical texts and engaged in intellectual debates. This deep engagement with the humanistic learning of the Renaissance suggests a mind capable of great complexity and nuance. Yet, this intellectual curiosity did not extend to an empathetic understanding of the monster girl. Rather, it seems to have reinforced her rational, detached approach to the world. Historians still argue whether Elizabeth I's famous Virgin Queen persona and her decision never to marry were primarily a clever political strategy to avoid foreign alliances and maintain domestic control by not yielding power to a husband, or if it was a deeply personal choice influenced by her tumultuous upbringing, witnessing her father's treatment of his wives and her own precarious position as a woman ruler. Did her calculated detachment from marriage mirror her detachment from figures like the monster girl, both serving her ultimate goal of absolute power and self-preservation? The debate explores the personal and political motivations behind her unique reign. You sense that Elizabeth's cold calculation towards the monster girl is not born of malice, but of a profound pragmatism, a survival instinct honed in the crucible of the Tudor court. She is learning the art of kingship, even as a child, and that art demands a certain ruthlessness, a capacity to disregard anything that does not serve the greater good of the realm, or more accurately, the greater good of her claim to the realm. For the monster girl, this meant that the future queen, who would later be celebrated for her strength and intellect, would offer no solace, no reprieve from her inherent humiliation. Her logical, detached gaze would simply confirm the girl's irrelevance, sealing her fate as an outcast in a world that demanded perfection and power. Having observed the spectrum of royal reactions, from Catherine's quiet empathy to Elizabeth's calculated detachment and Henry's chilling indifference, you now turn to the futile, often grotesque, attempts to cure the monster girl. This delves into the realm of Tudor medicine at its most desperate and unscientific, revealing a profound misunderstanding of congenital conditions and a reliance on practices that ranged from the bizarre to the truly torturous. Her life was not only a spectacle of humiliation, but also a canvas for medical quackery. You envision her being subjected to various physicians and healers, each armed with their own theories and remedies, none of them effective. These weren't necessarily malicious individuals, but rather men, and occasionally women, operating under the severe limitations of their era's knowledge. They were confronted with something entirely beyond their comprehension, and their responses, while born of a desire to fix the anomaly, only added to her suffering. The relentless scrutiny of her body, the poking and prodding, the forced ingestion of vile concoctions. It was a different kind of humiliation, a violation dressed up as care. Imagine the procession of these so-called experts. First, perhaps the royal physicians, learned men steeped in the ancient Greek and Roman texts of Galen and Hippocrates. Their diagnosis would invariably fall back on the theory of humours, an imbalance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile or black bile. They might prescribe a rigorous regimen of purges, forcing her to drink emetics to induce vomiting, or strong laxatives to cleanse her system. You picture the agony of her body being violently expelled, weakening her already fragile constitution, all in the misguided belief that expelling bad humours would rectify her physical form. Then came the bloodletting. A common cure-all for almost any ailment, this practice involved opening a vein, often in the arm, to drain what was believed to be excess or corrupted blood. You can almost see the leeches, fat and engorged clinging to her skin, or the sharp glint of the lancet. The goal was to rebalance her internal fluids, but the reality was often weakness, dizziness, and the risk of infection. For someone already struggling with physical anomalies, the loss of blood would have been debilitating, yet it was likely a regular occurrence in her treatment plan. Beyond the humoral theory, you would witness attempts at external manipulation. Perhaps a surgeon, more akin to a barber than a modern doctor, might propose crude attempts at straightening her limbs or spine, using rudimentary braces or even forceful manipulation that would cause immense pain and likely further damage rather than correct. Imagine the searing pain, the agonizing pressure, as untrained hands attempted to reshape bone and muscle without anesthesia or proper anatomical knowledge. Her screams, if she dared to utter them, would likely be dismissed as the irrational cries of a deformed mind. Then came the truly bizarre and superstitious cures. You might hear of a cunning woman from the countryside being brought in, offering charms and incantations. She might advise bathing the girl in strange herbal infusions or having her wear amulets made of specific stones or animal parts. Some might even suggest applying poultices made from bizarre ingredients, like powdered toad or dried raven's feet, all based on sympathetic magic or ancient folklore. These remedies, while perhaps less physically invasive than the physician's interventions, were deeply unsettling, preying on the desperation of a family who saw no other recourse. You can almost smell the pungent aroma of these concoctions. Bitter herbs, strange animal musk, the metallic tang of blood, mingling with the ever-present scent of human desperation. She would be forced to endure these treatments, not out of her own will, but because she was a royal ward, a project to be fixed, or at least contained. Her lack of agency in her own medical care is another layer of her humiliation. Her body was not her own, but a public curiosity to be experimented upon. One mainstream historical fact that underlines the medical limitations of the era is the absence of germ theory and antiseptics. This meant that any invasive procedure, from bloodletting to crude surgery, carried an enormous risk of infection, often leading to gangrene, sepsis, and death. The very attempts to cure her could easily have killed her, a common tragedy in pre-modern medicine. A quirky or fringe tidbit of Tudor medicine that reveals its less savoury side is the use of human skull powder, mumia, as a remedy for various ailments, including epilepsy and melancholy. This grisly practice, driven by beliefs in vital essences, involved grinding up human bones, often from ancient graves, and administering them to patients. While perhaps not directly used for congenital deformities, it showcases the lengths to which people would go, and the bizarre ingredients they would consume in search of a cure, highlighting the era's blend of superstition and a desperate hunger for remedies. Historians still argue whether the widespread reliance on superstitious remedies and folk magic alongside academic medicine during the Tudor era indicates a fundamental lack of faith in formal physicians, or if it simply reflects a society that saw no hard distinction between the scientific and the supernatural, believing both could influence health and disease. Did people turn to cunning folk out of desperation, or because they genuinely believed these practices were as valid as, or even superior to, conventional treatments? The debate explores the boundaries of knowledge and belief in a pre-Enlightenment world. You watch her endure these futile interventions, her small body a canvas for the era's ignorance and superstition. Each failed cure reinforces the belief that her condition is incurable, perhaps even a divine mark. The physicians would eventually throw up their hands, declaring her case beyond their remedies, perhaps whispering of her innate evil or unchangeable nature. This cycle of hope, painful intervention, and ultimate failure only deepened her isolation and confirmed her status as an unfixable problem. Her body, already a source of public shame, became a laboratory for futile experiments, a living testament to the era's inability to comprehend, let alone heal, her unique existence. The humiliation was not just in her appearance, but in the relentless, painful, and ultimately pointless efforts to erase it. Despite the relentless humiliation, the fruitless medical interventions, and the chilling indifference of the court, you now witness a fragile, almost imperceptible shift in her fate, a brief glimmer of hope. It's not a miraculous cure nor a sudden outpouring of royal affection, but a fleeting possibility, a change in circumstances that, for a moment, promises a different path for the monster girl. This hope, however, is as fragile as a spiderweb, easily broken by the slightest gust of courtly wind. You find yourself observing a different dynamic unfold, perhaps initiated by a change in court personnel or a subtle political realignment. It could be the arrival of a new, less prejudiced lady-in-waiting in a position of influence, or a temporary surge of piety among certain courtiers who, perhaps after a personal tragedy or a religious awakening, decide to perform acts of charity. Whatever the catalyst, a small window opens, allowing a sliver of light to penetrate her shadowed existence. Perhaps a gentle governess, newly assigned to the household, or simply braver than her predecessors, begins to treat the girl not as an object of pity or scorn, but as a child worthy of basic human decency. You might see this governess reading to her, perhaps simple tales or verses from the Bible, or teaching her a practical skill, something to occupy her mind and hands beyond the confines of her isolation. It's a quiet act of defiance against the prevailing courtly attitude, a subtle acknowledgement of her inner life, her potential. For a brief period, the girl might experience the profound comfort of consistent, gentle attention, a luxury she has never known. You could imagine a scenario where her presence becomes marginally more accepted, perhaps even tolerated, within a smaller, less public circle. Maybe a minor noble seeking to curry favour, or genuinely influenced by a more compassionate worldview, perhaps subtly encouraged by Catherine of Aragon's example, extends a quiet gesture of inclusion. This might involve allowing her to sit on the periphery of a private gathering, or permitting her to attend a subdued religious service without drawing the usual barrage of stares and whispers. It's not full integration, not true acceptance, but a temporary reprieve from outright ostracisation. This glimmer of hope isn't about her physical appearance changing, but about the perception of it softening, even for a moment. The cruel jokes might become less frequent, the stares less prolonged. The air around her might feel marginally lighter, less charged with fear and disgust. This period, however brief, represents a precious opportunity for her to breathe, to experience a fragment of peace, to perhaps even nurture a fragile sense of self-worth that has been systematically denied her. You see her eyes, usually downcast, lifting ever so slightly, a faint shadow of curiosity replacing the habitual resignation. The nature of this hope is inherently fragile because it is not institutionalized. It depends entirely on the goodwill of a few individuals, on the temporary sway of a certain faction, or on a passing mood within the capricious court. It is not codified into royal decree, nor is it championed by a powerful patron. It is a moment of grace, unearned and easily rescinded, a fleeting anomaly in the otherwise relentless narrative of her humiliation. You understand that true, lasting change would require a revolution in understanding, a shift in deeply ingrained societal prejudice, something far beyond the capacity of even the kindest individual within the Tudor machine. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates the volatile nature of court life and how quickly fortunes could change, impacting everyone from the highest noble to the lowest servant, is the constant ebb and flow of royal favour and factional power struggles during Henry VIII's reign. The rise and fall of figures like Anne Boleyn, Thomas Wolsey and Thomas Cromwell demonstrate that one day's triumph could be the next day's execution. This instability meant that any positive change in the monster girl's circumstances would always be precarious, dependent on the fickle tides of courtly politics and personal influence. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the era that exemplifies the fleeting nature of comfort or luxury for non-royals is the practice of gifting discarded royal clothing to servants or favoured lesser nobles. These garments, though magnificent, were rarely worn more than a few times by the monarch. While a grand gesture, it also meant that a servant's sudden wealth in clothing was entirely dependent on royal whim, not stable income. Our monster girl might have received a slightly better gown during this hopeful period, but it would be a hand-me-down, a temporary improvement, not a sign of fundamental change in her status. It's a poignant reminder that even small improvements were still subject to the hierarchy. Historians still argue whether such isolated acts of kindness towards the marginalised in powerful historical courts were genuinely driven by individual moral conscience, or if they were often subtly motivated by a desire for social distinction or religious piety, seeking to gain favour with God or appear virtuous to a specific faction. Was the compassion authentic? Or was it a form of virtuous performance in a highly visible society? The debate touches on the complex motivations behind acts of charity within a rigidly structured social system. You sense the shift in the air, the slight lessening of tension around her. For a moment she is less monster and more unfortunate child. This brief interlude of gentler treatment allows you to glimpse a personality perhaps, a flicker of curiosity, a shy smile, a preference for a particular kind of food or a gentle colour. It reminds you that beneath the layers of deformity and societal scorn, there is a person, a soul, longing for connection and kindness. But you also know the Tudor court too well. This moment, this fragile hope, is precisely that, a moment. It is a temporary anomaly in a relentless storm, a brief, bittersweet reprieve before the inevitable return to the shadows, the full weight of her enduring humiliation. The knowledge of its impermanence makes this glimmer of hope all the more poignant, a cruel tease of a life that was never meant to be hers. As quickly as the fragile glimmer of hope appeared, you witness it recede, swallowed by the relentless and often brutal currents of Tudor politics. The monster girl finds her already precarious existence further buffeted by the shifting sands of power, her fate inextricably linked to the volatile fortunes of the court. Her personal tragedy becomes a mere subplot in the grand, dangerous drama of dynastic succession and religious upheaval. You observe how changes in royal favour, often as sudden and devastating as a summer storm, directly impact her fragile circumstances. Perhaps a patron who had shown her a modicum of kindness falls out of favour, is accused of treason, or simply retires from court. With their departure, any small protections or privileges extended to her vanish. The gentle governess who read to her might be replaced by a sterner, more conventional attendant, eager to toe the courtly line and re-establish the customary distance and disdain. The brief moments of quiet solace are swiftly extinguished, replaced by the familiar chill of neglect. The rise and fall of queens, in particular, sends seismic waves through the royal household. When Catherine of Aragon is cast aside for Anne Boleyn, then Anne for Jane Seymour, and so on, each transition brings a complete upheaval of staff, alliances, and social norms. Each new queen brings her own retinue, her own priorities, and her own sensibilities. For the monster girl, this means repeated assessments, renewed whispers, and the constant threat of being moved, hidden, or even entirely forgotten amidst the chaos. The brief periods of quiet tolerance are obliterated by the need for new queens to assert their authority and cleanse the court of any remnants of the past. You notice how the girl's very presence, though marginalised, can become a silent weapon in courtly manoeuvring. A rival faction might subtly emphasise her existence, hinting at ill omens or divine disfavour, trying to undermine the perceived perfection of the reigning monarch or their chosen queen. She becomes an inconvenient truth, a visible flaw in the fabric of the Tudor dynasty, and thus a pawn in a game she doesn't even know she's playing. The more desperate the political climate, the more likely her unusual presence is to be whispered about, twisted, and exploited, however indirectly. The religious upheavals, too, leave their mark on her. As England swings between Catholicism and Protestantism under Henry, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, the philosophical underpinnings of society are constantly in flux. One day, her condition might be viewed through a Catholic lens of suffering and divine will, the next through a Protestant lens of predestination or moral failing. These shifts, while seemingly abstract, directly influence the attitudes of those around her, either softening or hardening their hearts, depending on the prevailing theology. You see how she is, in a profound way, a victim of theological uncertainty as much as medical ignorance. Her movements within the palace or between various royal residences become more frequent and less stable. She might be shuttled from one wing to another, or from a major palace to a more obscure manor house, depending on who is in favour, who finds her presence too uncomfortable, or who wishes to demonstrate their complete detachment from her. Each relocation is a new disruption, a fresh start for the cycle of stares and whispers, preventing any sense of stability or belonging from taking root. She's a package to be moved, a problem to be shifted, rather than a person with a right to a stable home. You observe the subtle ways courtiers adapt to these shifts, mimicking the prevailing attitudes of the powerful. If a new queen, or a rising minister, expresses a particular disdain for anomalies, the courtiers quickly follow suit, ensuring that their own behaviour aligns with the new power structure. This chameleon-like adaptability means that any glimmer of hope, any temporary softening of attitudes towards the monster girl is always fragile, always subject to the fickle whims of those at the top. The collective gaze hardens again, and the wall of isolation rebuilds itself, often stronger than before. One mainstream historical fact that powerfully illustrates this volatility is the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII. This massive political and religious upheaval not only destroyed ancient institutions, but also displaced thousands of people, from monks and nuns to the sick and poor who relied on monastic charity. If the monster girl had found any support or refuge within a monastic setting, it would have been cruelly swept away by this dramatic shift in royal policy, highlighting how vast political changes could utterly devastate individual lives, particularly the most vulnerable. A quirky or fringe tidbit from the Tudor court, which ironically contrasts with the girl's insecurity, is the extraordinary lengths courtiers went to secure official positions and patents, often bribing officials or spending fortunes to get a foot in the door. Once secured, these positions were fiercely protected, as they guaranteed income and access to royal favour. For the monster girl, there was no such stable position to be secured, no official role that would guarantee her sustenance or safety, making her utterly vulnerable to every shift in courtly wind. Historians still argue whether the extreme political manoeuvring and Machiavellian tactics common in the Tudor court were primarily a product of the personalities of the monarchs, e.g. Henry VIII's ruthlessness, Elizabeth I's pragmatism, or if they were an inevitable outcome of the highly centralised and intensely competitive nature of absolute monarchy, where power was concentrated and access to it was the sole determinant of wealth and survival. Was it the individuals, or the system itself that drove such instability and its ripple effects on those like the monster girl? The debate delves into the interplay between character and political structure. You feel the palpable shift in the atmosphere, the tightening of smiles, the renewed intensity of the whispers. The brief period of reprieve is over. The court, ever fluid and ruthless, has moved on, and she, the monster girl, is once again pushed back into the shadows, a visible reminder of human imperfection in a world that demands flawless power. Her life, you realise, is not her own. It is a pawn in a larger game, tossed about by forces entirely beyond her control, destined to be reshuffled and re-evaluated with every rise and fall of a powerful courtier or a new royal spouse. Her fragile hope, like so many other things in the Tudor court, was ultimately crushed beneath the weight of relentless political ambition, deepening her enduring humiliation. The fleeting glimmer of hope extinguished, the political tides having pushed her back into the deep shadows, you now observe the monster girl settling into a pattern of quiet, lonely existence. This is not the dramatic isolation of a prisoner, nor the bustling anonymity of a servant in a large household. It is a unique form of solitude, one lived in plain sight, constantly exposed to scrutiny yet utterly untouched by genuine connection. Her life becomes a quiet testament to endurance, punctuated only by the routine cruelties of a court that refuses to truly see her. You see her moving through the periphery of the palace, a ghost in the grand machinery of royal life. Her days are structured by simple, often menial tasks, perhaps tending to a small neglected corner of a garden, or assisting a scullery maid in a remote kitchen far from the main culinary bustle. These tasks are given not out of necessity, but as a means to keep her occupied, to provide a semblance of purpose, and most importantly, to keep her out of sight of the more important courtiers. She performs these duties with a quiet resignation, her movements slow and deliberate, as if each action is weighed down by the invisible chains of her solitude. Her meals, you notice, are taken alone, or with the lowest-ranking servants who are too insignificant to care about social standing, or too hardened by their own difficult lives to bother with pretense. She eats in silence, perhaps quickly, avoiding eye contact, conscious of the space she occupies, eager to disappear back into her quiet corner. There are no shared jokes, no casual conversations, no moments of camaraderie. Food is sustenance, nothing more, devoid of the social ritual that defines mealtimes for everyone else in the court. Her attire remains simple, practical and unadorned. It is not the livery of a specific department, nor the fine garments of a lady-in-waiting. Instead, it is likely plain wool or linen, colours that blend into the background. Grey, brown, muted green. These clothes are not chosen for comfort or style, but for their ability to render her invisible, to emphasize her status as an unperson. You imagine the worn fabric, the simple cut, a stark contrast to the rustling silks and shimmering velvets that glide past her in the corridors. Even her clothing is a form of quiet humiliation, a constant reminder of her place, or lack thereof. Her interactions with others are minimal, reduced to clipped instructions from supervisors or the occasional dismissive comment from a passing courtier. When spoken to, her responses are likely terse, almost whispered, a reflection of years of being silenced and ignored. She has learned that drawing attention to herself only invites further scrutiny and pain. Her world shrinks to the immediate space around her, her thoughts turned inward, her mind a fortress against the constant barrage of subtle insults and pointed gazes. You observe the profound loneliness that clings to her like a shroud. There are no friends, no confidants, no one to share a secret smile or a quiet moment of understanding. Holidays, celebrations, and grand court events, which bring joy and revelry to others, only serve to highlight her isolation. She's present, physically, but entirely absent from the spirit of the occasion, a silent observer of a vibrant life she can never be part of. You see her standing alone in a crowded hall, a poignant emblem of human solitude amidst a throng. One mainstream historical fact that sheds light on this extreme isolation is the concept of social death within historical courts. For individuals deemed unworthy or unnatural, they might be physically present but were socially erased. They held no status, no influence, and often no acknowledged identity beyond their perceived flaw. This social death was a powerful tool of control and exclusion, far more insidious than physical imprisonment, as it condemned an individual to a living oblivion within the very heart of society. A quirky or fringe tidbit of the era, which underscores her emotional deprivation, is the popularity of elaborate allegorical garden designs in Tudor estates. These gardens were not just for beauty, but for philosophical contemplation, often featuring mazes, hidden grottos, and symbolic plantings, designed for leisurely strolls and intimate conversations. For the monster girl, such a garden might be a place of quiet refuge, a sanctuary from the human gaze, but she would be exploring it alone, denied the companionship and intellectual exchange that these spaces were designed for. Her solitude would fill even these beautiful designed spaces. Historians still argue whether the apparent lack of structured social support or compassionate institutions for the severely disabled or deformed in Tudor England was primarily due to resource scarcity and the overwhelming pressures of survival in a pre-modern society, or if it stemmed from a more ingrained cultural and religious prejudice that viewed such conditions as moral failings or divine punishment, thus lessening any societal imperative for care. Was it a practical limitation or a moral failing of the age? The debate touches on the intersection of economics, theology, and social ethics. You perceive that this quiet, lonely existence is, in its own way, a profound form of humiliation. It is the humiliation of being consistently overlooked, of being deemed unworthy of attention, of affection, of belonging. She's not actively tormented every moment, but the subtle, pervasive neglect is a constant, grinding erosion of her spirit. She becomes a master of self-effacement, learning to fade into the background, to become almost imperceptible. This ability to disappear, honed over years of being unwanted, is both a survival mechanism and a tragic surrender. She exists, but she does not live, merely endures, a forgotten shadow in the glittering, bustling heart of the Tudor court, forever marked by her visible difference and the collective decision of society to turn away. Her solitude is her constant companion, and her humiliation, a silent, unceasing ache. Having absorbed the profound loneliness that defined her quiet existence, you are now confronted with the harsh reality of her public spectacle and private shame. The Tudor court, ever a stage for power and display, inadvertently cast her as a living cautionary tale, a visible representation of imperfection in a world obsessed with lineage and divine favour. Every time she was glimpsed, however briefly, she became an unwilling performer in a grim, unspoken drama, her physical anomalies magnified by the collective gaze. You watch as she is occasionally, perhaps inevitably, brought into view during a court procession or a particularly grand gathering. It's never a deliberate display, not like a formal show, but her very presence, however fleeting, becomes an event. Heads turn, whispers ripple, and a wave of silent, uncomfortable fascination washes over the assembly. You feel the collective intake of breath, the subtle shift in posture as courtiers adjust to the unsettling sight. This isn't about admiration or respect, it's about a morbid curiosity, a confirmation of their own perceived normalcy against her stark difference. Her humiliation is public, performed without her consent, simply by existing. Imagine the weight of those hundreds of eyes not looking at her, but through her, or at her deformities as if she were a scientific specimen or a moral lesson. You see her head bow lower, her movements become even more hesitant, a desperate attempt to shrink, to disappear, to evade the relentless scrutiny. The grandness of the hall, the vibrant colours of the tapestries, the sparkle of jewels, all of it serves to highlight her plainness, her perceived ugliness, her profound otherness. She's a dissonant note in a carefully orchestrated symphony of perfection. The whispers, though hushed, are amplified by the court's acoustics, carrying snippets of judgment to her ears. A poor creature. God's judgment, surely. Unnatural. Each word is a barb, piercing her already fragile sense of self. She might develop a heightened sense of hearing, an acute awareness of the slightest shift in tone, the most subtle intake of breath, signalling that she has been seen and judged once again. Her private shame, cultivated in isolated childhood, is brutally exposed in these public moments, reinforcing her deepest fears about her own inherent worthlessness. You observe the cruel irony. While her very presence caused discomfort, her absence would also be noted. If she were too successfully hidden, questions might arise, rumours might spread. She existed in a paradoxical space. She must be present enough to confirm her existence, but not so present as to be truly seen as a human. It was a delicate, tortuous balance, always leaning towards her public visibility and subsequent private suffering. Her life was a tightrope walk over an abyss of societal rejection. The young children of the court, less constrained by adult pretense, often reflect the harshest reality of this public shame. You might see a child point directly, or whisper loudly, their innocence not yet tempered by social filters. A parent would quickly hush them, but the damage is done. The girl has seen the raw, unvarnished reaction, a reflection of the unspoken truth held by the adults. These are the moments that cut deepest, reinforcing the message that she is inherently frightening or repellent. Her shame is not just about her physical form, but about the societal narrative imposed upon it. She's not simply a girl with a condition. She is, to the Tudor court, a symbol of divine displeasure, a harbinger of ill fortune, a defect in the royal tapestry. This symbolic weight, far heavier than her own body, crushes her spirit. She internalizes this narrative, believing the whispers, living the shame, convinced that her very existence is an affront. This profound internalization of public judgment is the core of her private shame. One mainstream historical fact that underscores the public nature of shaming in this era is the use of public punishments like the pillory and stocks, and the display of traitors' heads on spikes. While the monster girl was not a criminal, the societal impulse to publicly display and shame those who deviated from the norm, whether morally or physically, was deeply ingrained. Her visibility, though not a formal punishment, served a similar purpose, to reinforce societal boundaries and expectations through the public exhibition of an other. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the visual, often judgmental, nature of Tudor society is the popularity of satirical broadsides and woodcuts depicting various social types, moral failings, and physical caricatures. These crude but widely circulated images often exaggerated features to mock or condemn. While not directly aimed at her, the cultural precedent for visually scrutinizing and often deforming bodies through art for public consumption would have contributed to the general atmosphere where her own physical appearance was endlessly dissected and exaggerated in the public imagination. Historians still argue whether the extreme emphasis on physical normalcy and the shaming of deviations in Tudor society was primarily a legacy of medieval Christian thought, which often linked physical imperfection to sin, or if it was more strongly influenced by the emerging Renaissance ideal of human perfection derived from classical Greek and Roman aesthetics. Was it a theological condemnation or an artistic ideal that drove this public humiliation? The debate touches on the complex interplay of religious doctrine and evolving aesthetic standards in shaping social prejudice. You feel the palpable weight of her silent suffering in these moments of public exposure, the sheer injustice of it, the quiet agony of being judged for something entirely beyond her control, is almost unbearable to witness. Her private shame is a wound that never heals, constantly reopened by every whispered comment, every averted gaze, every moment she is forced to exist in the spotlight of the court's cruel curiosity. She is a constant reminder of humanity's capacity for both resilience and profound unkindness, a tragic figure forever caught between her inner self and the devastating public perception of her monstrous form. Her entire being screams for invisibility, yet the court ensures she remains a constant if uncomfortable presence, a testament to her unending, unyielding humiliation. Stepping back from the immediate pain of her public humiliation and private shame, you begin to consider her place in the grand sweep of history. You realise that the monster girl, far from being a mere footnote, represents a profound challenge to historical memory. Her story, a quiet tragedy played out in the opulent halls of power, has often been misrepresented, distorted, or even entirely erased, a testament to society's enduring discomfort with imperfection and its tendency to sanitize narratives. You delve into the archives, or rather you imagine doing so, sifting through dusty court records, personal letters, and chronicles of the age. What you find is often frustratingly sparse. There might be fleeting mentions of an unfortunate child in the royal household accounts, a ledger entry for her modest clothing or food, but there is no grand biography, no detailed description of her life, no portrait that accurately captures her true appearance beyond the cruel caricatures of the court's imagination. Her existence is largely reduced to an absence, a gap in the meticulously recorded lives of the Tudors. This lack of detailed historical record, you realise, is a form of secondary humiliation. Not only was she humiliated in life, but her very memory has been subjected to a historical erasure. The chroniclers of the age, eager to praise the beauty and prowess of their monarchs and courtiers, had no interest in documenting an anomaly that contradicted the desired narrative of perfection and divine favour. Her story was deemed unworthy of preservation, perhaps even an embarrassment that should be forgotten. You feel the weight of this historical silence, a testament to how effectively society can silence uncomfortable truths. When she's mentioned, it is often in the context of moralising tales or superstitious warnings. You might find a brief reference in a sermon, where her existence is used as an example of God's mysterious ways or as a warning against sin. Or perhaps a philosophical treatise might touch upon monstrous births as a category, lumping her in with animals and other natural oddities, further stripping her of her human particularity. Her identity is subsumed into a broader dehumanizing classification, serving only as a didactic tool for others. Consider the role of folklore and oral tradition. In an age where news travelled by word of mouth, her story would undoubtedly have been distorted and exaggerated as it spread beyond the court walls. The monster girl of the court would become a figure of local legend, perhaps imbued with supernatural powers or associated with misfortune. The truth of her human suffering would be lost in the sensationalism, turning her into a mythical creature rather than a real person. This misrepresentation further alienates her from her own lived experience, replacing it with a fantastical, yet equally dehumanizing narrative. You also reflect on the biases inherent in historical reporting. Most accounts from the Tudor period were written by men, often educated clergy or courtiers, who held specific social and religious views. These views dictated what was considered important, what was worthy of record, and how anomalies should be interpreted. They were not equipped, either intellectually or emotionally, to understand or portray a congenital condition with empathy or accuracy. Their records, therefore, reflect their own prejudices and fears, not the girl's reality. The modern tendency to romanticize or sensationalize figures from history also poses a challenge to understanding her legacy. Some might be tempted to turn her into a tragic heroine, others into a grotesque villain. Neither extreme captures the nuanced reality of a life lived under the constant pressure of difference. Her true legacy lies not in a dramatic narrative, but in the quiet, persistent struggle against prejudice and the profound human capacity for indifference. One mainstream historical fact that illustrates the prevailing mindset regarding physical anomalies is the absence of any formal, publicly funded institutions specifically for the care or education of the physically or intellectually disabled in Tudor England. While some charitable institutions might have existed, they were few and far between, and the primary responsibility for unfortunates fell to families if they chose to acknowledge it, or to local parishes if they were poor. This societal void meant individuals like her were largely left to private, often neglectful arrangements, which contributes to their historical invisibility. A quirky or fringe tidbit that illuminates the era's skewed perception is the widespread belief in the signatures of nature, where physical appearance was thought to directly reflect inner character or divine will. A person with a deformed limb might be seen as inherently wicked, or a mole might be interpreted as a sign of ill fortune. This made it virtually impossible for someone with her visible differences to escape moral judgment, regardless of their actual conduct. It's an almost fantastical level of correlation between the outward and inward self. Historians still argue whether the deliberate omission or sanitization of uncomfortable truths about individuals like the monster girl from official historical records was a conscious act of censorship by the powerful to maintain an idealized image of the monarchy, or if it was simply a natural consequence of the prevailing cultural norms that deemed such subjects unworthy of serious chronicling. Was it an active suppression of narrative, or a passive dismissal born of prejudice? The debate touches on the ethics of historical interpretation and the power dynamics inherent in shaping the past. You understand that her legacy is one of profound misunderstanding. She exists in history not as a person, but as an echo, a whispered fragment of what society deemed undesirable. Her story is a testament to the persistent human struggle to categorize, to normalize, and to often dehumanize that which does not fit. Yet, in her very elusiveness, in the gaps and silences of the historical record, her story retains a haunting power. It forces you to confront the uncomfortable truths about societal prejudice, about the cost of conformity, and about the enduring challenge of seeing humanity in those deemed other. Her humiliation, even centuries later, continues to resonate, a silent accusation against the very fabric of the court that tried so hard to forget her. Despite the historical erasure and the persistent efforts to marginalize her, you perceive that the monster girl's presence, however unwanted, left an indelible if subtle mark on the royal halls. Like a phantom limb, her existence, even in its quiet desperation, shaped the dynamics of the court, influencing perceptions, subtly reinforcing social norms, and casting a long, uncomfortable shadow over the glittering facade of Tudor power. She was an unignorable anomaly, and her very being became a silent yet powerful catalyst for unspoken reactions. You imagine her unseen influence permeating the atmosphere. Her presence served as a constant, if unwelcome, reminder to the courtiers of their own precarious mortality and the unpredictable nature of divine will. In a world where beauty and physical perfection were seen as signs of God's favour, she was a living counter-argument, a disquieting presence that whispered of vulnerability and imperfection. This underlying anxiety, though rarely acknowledged, undoubtedly coloured their interactions, making them more rigid, more outwardly pious, more desperate to affirm their own unblemished status. Consider the subtle ways she affected courtly conversation. While direct references to her might have been rare in polite company, she undoubtedly became a touchstone for discussions about unnatural births, God's judgments, or the mysteries of creation. Her existence provided a real-life example for abstract theological or philosophical debates, shaping how courtiers understood their place in the universe and the arbitrary nature of fate. She was a living embodiment of the other, forcing a subtle, internal reckoning for those who dared to truly contemplate her. You observe how her marginalized status implicitly reinforced the prevailing social hierarchy. By existing at the very bottom, an object of universal scorn or indifference, she allowed others to define themselves in opposition to her. The healthy, the beautiful, the well-formed could privately congratulate themselves on their own good fortune, their own normalcy, reinforcing their sense of superiority. She became a societal baseline, a measure against which all others could feel reassuringly better, thus solidifying the rigid social order. Her humiliation, in a perverse way, served the comfort of the privileged. Her presence might also have subtly influenced the way the royal family presented itself to the public. The more pronounced her difference, the more insistent the monarchy might have been on projecting an image of flawless health, abundant progeny, and divine favour. Portraits might become even more idealised. royal appearances more carefully choreographed to emphasise strength and vitality. She was the hidden truth that demanded a more dazzling lie, forcing the court to work harder to maintain its illusion of perfection. You consider the architectural and logistical adjustments made for her. While not grand, these would have been necessary. Special out-of-the-way rooms, careful routing through less trafficked corridors, discreet arrangements for her care. These small, practical adaptations, though designed to keep her hidden, nonetheless acknowledged her existence and altered the physical flow of the palace. Every time a door was closed to hide her, or a path rerouted to avoid her, she exerted a subtle, almost invisible influence on the very structure of the court. And then there's the quiet shame she undoubtedly instilled in some. While most courtiers might have been openly disdainful or indifferent, you imagine that a few, perhaps those with a deeper conscience or a more humane upbringing, would have felt a flicker of discomfort, a pang of guilt, witnessing her suffering. This private shame, though rarely acted upon, would have contributed to the complex emotional tapestry of the court, adding a subtle undercurrent of unease beneath the surface of grandiosity. She was a living mirror, reflecting back the court's own capacity for unkindness. One mainstream historical fact that demonstrates the court's obsession with image, indirectly influenced by figures like her, is the meticulous planning and exorbitant cost of royal progresses, travels, throughout the kingdom. These were grand spectacles designed to impress and awe the populace, showcasing the monarch's power, wealth, and divine approval. The presence of someone who visually contradicted this image, even when carefully hidden, would only intensify the need for such dazzling public displays to affirm royal perfection. A quirky or fringe tidbit that reveals the depth of Tudor symbolic thinking and how she might have been perceived is the widespread belief in teratoscopy, the interpretation of monstrous births as omens or prophecies. This was not just a folk belief. Learned scholars and theologians would seriously debate the meaning of unusual births, often linking them to political events, natural disasters, or the moral state of the realm. Even if she was not publicly analysed in this way, the cultural framework existed to interpret her as a sign, making her a silent, unsettling prophecy within the court. Historians still argue whether the perceived moral decay of the late Tudor court, particularly under Henry VIII's later years, was genuinely linked to the breakdown of traditional religious structures and moral authority, as Catholic sympathisers argued, or if it was more a consequence of the increasingly ruthless pursuit of personal power and wealth that characterised the period's political landscape. Did the court's treatment of the monster girl reflect a general decline in ethical standards, or was it simply an amplification of pre-existing prejudices within a hyper-competitive environment? The debate touches on the moral consequences of absolute power. You understand that her subtle mark on the royal halls was not one of influence or power, but one of silent accusation. She was the uncomfortable truth that the court tried to bury beneath its finery and its boasts of divine favour. Her presence, however marginalised, served as a constant unspoken challenge to their self-perception, a reminder of vulnerability in an age obsessed with strength. The whispers, the averted gazes, the subtle adaptations, all of it points to her indelible, haunting presence. Her humiliation was not just personal. It became a silent, pervasive element of the court's own self-deception, an enduring echo in the grand echoing chambers of Tudor power. She was the shadow that proved the light, an unwanted but utterly inescapable reality. You have journeyed through her early isolation, witnessed the court's cruelty, and understood the profound depths of her humiliation. Now, as the narrative draws to a close, you approach the ultimate mystery, her final solace, and the lingering questions that remain. Her end, like much of her life, is shrouded in the mists of history, a quiet fade from the public eye rather than a dramatic conclusion. It is in this ambiguity that her story finds its most poignant, and perhaps most enduring resonance. You imagine her final years, still within the confines of a royal household, though perhaps a more secluded one. The grand, bustling court might have been too much, even for its own jaded sensibilities, to bear the constant reminder of her presence. She might have been moved to a dower house, a lesser manor, or a quiet corner of a vast estate far from the main arteries of power. Here, the immediate crushing weight of public scrutiny might have lessened, replaced by a more passive neglect from a smaller, less ambitious household staff. This, in itself, could have been a form of solace, the absence of direct cruelty. Her physical condition, having been present since birth, would likely have worsened with age, or at least continued its relentless course. The deformities that made her an object of fascination would have become more pronounced, her movements perhaps more restricted, her discomfort more acute. Yet, the remedies, if any were still offered, would remain as futile as ever. She would have entered a phase of quiet, physical decline, a mirroring of her social one, but perhaps also a release from the expectations of appearance. You might imagine her finding a fragile peace in the mundane rhythms of daily life, away from the court's relentless gaze. The rustle of leaves outside her window, the quiet chirping of birds, the warmth of a simple fire, these might become her companions. Without the constant pressure to perform, to disappear, she might have found a small measure of internal quiet. Perhaps she found solace in the repetition of prayers, or in the simple act of breathing, each breath a victory over a body that defied the world's expectations. Her death, when it came, would likely have been unremarkable to the powerful. A brief entry in a ledger, a simple funeral, unadorned by royal pomp. There would be no public mourning, no grand eulogies. She would simply cease to be, vanishing from the records as quietly as she lived. Her passing would have been noted by a handful of dutiful servants, perhaps a chaplain, and then swiftly forgotten by the wider court, consumed by its own endless machinations. Her final resting place, if known, would be humble, a simple grave in a small churchyard, far from the elaborate tombs of kings and queens. Yet, despite this quiet end, lingering questions persist. What were her thoughts in her final moments? Did she find peace? Did she ever truly understand why she was so reviled? Or did she internalize the court's judgment, dying with the belief that she was indeed a monster? These questions, unanswerable now, serve as a poignant reminder of the humanity denied to her in life and the incompleteness of her historical record. Her story challenges us to look beyond the cold facts and consider the lived experience of profound otherness. Her very ambiguity, her lack of a clear, definitive narrative, forces us to confront our own biases and assumptions. We are left to imagine, to empathise, to piece together fragments of a life deliberately left unrecorded. This act of imaginative reconstruction becomes a powerful antidote to the historical erasure she suffered, transforming her from a forgotten anomaly into a catalyst for reflection. One mainstream historical fact that adds to the ambiguity of such marginalised lives is the patchy and often incomplete nature of parish records, particularly for the poor or those without official status. While royal births and deaths were meticulously documented, individuals like her who existed on the fringes might only appear in sporadic financial accounts or be mentioned in brief, dismissive notes, making it incredibly difficult for modern historians to fully reconstruct their lives and deaths. A quirky or fringe tidbit that highlights the lack of care and respect for such individuals, even in death, is the common practice of bone-picking in crowded churchyards, where graves were reopened after a period to make space for new burials, and older bones were unceremoniously moved to charnel houses or simply discarded. The idea of her humble remains being disturbed, even after death, further underscores the profound lack of dignity she might have experienced throughout her existence. Historians still argue whether the lack of detailed historical records for marginalised figures like the Monster Girl is primarily an unavoidable consequence of the pre-modern archival practices and the limited literacy of the age, or if it represents a conscious or unconscious act of exclusion by the dominant powers who controlled the narrative, seeking to erase inconvenient truths from the official memory. Was it simply a practical limitation, or a deliberate silencing? The debate encourages us to critically examine the sources we rely on to understand the past. You're left with a profound sense of the enduring injustice she faced. Her life was a testament to the brutal realities of a society that prized conformity and punished difference. Her humiliation was multifaceted: physical, social, emotional, and ultimately historical. Yet, in her quiet endurance, in the very questions her existence poses, she carves out her own unique place in history. She reminds us that even in the most glittering and powerful courts, there are always shadows, always those cast aside, and that true humanity is found not in perfection, but in compassion for the imperfect. Her story, though painful, resonates as a timeless reminder of the power of prejudice and the quiet dignity of those who endure it. So, here we are, at the end of our journey through the Tudor court, and the quiet, haunting story of the monster girl. The torches have guttered low, the whispers have faded, and the grand hall is silent once more. Her life, a ripple in the vast ocean of history, has momentarily broken the surface, reminding us of the unseen currents beneath the celebrated narratives of kings and queens. You can almost feel the chill of the ancient stone seeping back into the air, carrying with it the echoes of forgotten pains and the profound solitude of a soul deemed unworthy. It's a heavy thought, isn't it? The sheer weight of a life lived in constant, unspoken humiliation. But even in its quiet tragedy, there's a certain resilience, a testament to the human spirit's ability to simply be, even when surrounded by profound unkindness. Let the echoes of her story drift away now, like smoke from a dying fire softening into the gentle hum of the night. Sleep calls, and with it, perhaps a deeper understanding of the silent battles fought in the grand, cruel theatre of history.